Hi, we're going to start by talking about weak entities versus strong entities. And another way of saying this is non-identifying entities versus identifying entities. And it's easy to see if we use the MySql workbench tool and we create relationships, it'll kind of explain what's going on with this. So you might have noticed over on the left-hand side when you go to create a relationship like a one-to-many, there's a dotted line version and a non-dotted line version, a solid version. And if you hover over it, it'll actually tell you what these are. The dotted one is a non-identifying relationship, and the solid one is an identifying relationship. And it's really talking about how strong the relationship between these two tables are. So if you think about what's going on, we have a vehicle. This is a particular instance of a car. And let's say we're designing the schema and we want a vehicle to have a car type. Now the question is, do we want someone in our database to be able to create a vehicle without a car type, or must they always create a car type? Now I'm going to show it to you first, letting the looser one, the weak or non-identifying relationship, where you can create a vehicle without a car type. For that, I would use the dotted line. This is the weaker one. And if I click on it, I do the many, I do the one, and I create that relationship. So here we go. If I hover over it, I'm going to see, if I highlight the window, I'm going to see it saying a non-identifying relationship. So I'm going to click on that. I click on the many, I click on the one, and it forms it. Now, to really see what has happened here, though, we're going to do forward engineering to see how it's laying out the schema, because then we're going to see exactly what's going on with this. So I'm going to go into database forward engineer, and I'm going to advance to the part where I can actually see what it's doing. And this is the table that has that one-to-many relationship. This is the vehicle table. Now, if you look at the primary key for this table, primary key is the vehicle ID. So when I create a row in the table, the primary key is just this vehicle ID. Okay, that seems fine. Then we have a foreign key talking about the car type there. Now let's do the exact same thing, but we're going to do a strong or identifying relationship. And we're going to see that this primary key changes. So here I'm going to do this again. I'm going to delete this relationship out. And I'm going to pick the strong relationship, do the many to the one. And now I'm going to forward engineer again, and we're going to see there's a difference. And I go to where it created it. Here it's saying, wait a minute, the primary key for this table is you must have vehicle ID and the car type ID. And you actually cannot create a row in the table unless this car type ID exists. So the difference, to summarize, is if we use the solid line, the identifying relationship, then the primary key is going to include that foreign key. In other words, the primary key is composed of two parts, the vehicle ID and also the car type ID. Those two pieces have to be added to insert the row because they're both part of the primary key. Here I have an example of a dotted line, and in this case, I would be able to create a car type without a manufacturing ID because the primary key just consists of the car type. So you just keep that in mind, the difference between the two. The dotted line, the solid line, is controlling a bit how you can create a row in the table and whether the primary key is made up of just the ID or the primary key is actually made up of the ID and a value from another table. Now, to make this seem a little bit more solid, And just to show you more how inserts work, because it can get a little confusing, we're going to take this kind of silly database I've created and actually build it, and we're going to do some inserts and kind of see how this plays out. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do the forward engineering, and I'm going to take it all the way forward and create the database. But I've done this several times, so I'm going to rename this database to be some new name so I don't get into complications with the existing databases I've created already. So I'll call it dealership 4, and I'll go ahead and I'll forward engineer this, and then we're going to start working with it. Okay, I created it. So I'm going to go over and I'm going to start actually seeing how I can do some insert statements and the problems that I'm going to run into. Now this module that we're working on, we're going to learn the insert statement, but for the time being, I'm just going to use their interface for inserting rows just to explain things. So let's suppose that I start by trying to create a vehicle. So here are the vehicle and here are the columns. And I'm just going to try to add one. Now, if you remember, this car type ID, which is referring to the car types table, I must create the car type before I can add the vehicle. So watch me try to do it without doing it. So I come here, the vehicle ID, I call it vehicle ID 1, and I'm just going to try to apply this, and it's going to say, you can't do this because this car type ID has not been filled in. That's because I made that be a solid relationship. So then what if I went to do this, well, okay, well, I need a car type, but if I go over to car types, I haven't created any car types yet. So let's suppose I try to do this. Okay, I need a car type. Let's say it's ID 100, and the model name is, let's say it's a Beetle, and the manufacturer ID, let's say, okay, I want that to be 1,000. Let's see what happens with that. It's not happy with that either because it's saying the foreign key constraint fails. I don't have, I said there's a manufacturer ID of 1,000 here. I said there's a manufacturer ID of 1,000, but there isn't because I don't think we have any manufacturers yet. So I have to create this first. So you can see it's kind of all cascading. So I have to create this first. And now let's say I actually do create something called 1,000. Volkswagen. So I create this row. That worked, and now I can back up and go back to car types. I might still have that SQL around. No, I do not. And I can actually apply this now. And that worked because I have the manufacturer ID, and now I have car type 100, so I can back up and I can go to the vehicle and I can add this in. I think we called it 100. And I added that. All right, let's move on and talk a little bit about inserts. So I'm going to go to the books database, and we're going to work with that a little bit, and we're going to show you a little bit about inserts. And we're going to make an insert into the author table. Now, the author table consists of these columns here that you're probably familiar with now, and I'm going to write an insert statement. Now, one way to write it is by not identifying the columns, and this is a little bit risky when you do it this way, but the way you do it is you say insert into authors, and now I have to give it the values. Now, if you don't identify the columns, you're going to give it the values to use, and you must get these values in the precise order that these columns are listed. So let me just kind of copy these values in because I've already have them typed out here. So I'm going to put the values in. And so if I did this insert statement, it would know that A10 is the author ID because that's the first column that applies. Okay, so that's one way to do it. It's a little bit risky, of course, because if you get something out of order, it's just going to put it in and blindly in a way. So another way to do it where it's a little bit more organized is you can tell it the order of the names that you're inserting. So let me show you how that looks. So I could say, instead of saying that, I could do it this way. Here I'm saying, okay, insert into authors, and I'm calling out the order of these columns, and here's the data that I'm inserting. So that's a little bit of a safer way to do it. Let's quickly look at an update statement. So I can make an update statement that says, I want to change, that's the update command, authors in some way, and I want to set a field, a column name, an attribute equal to a specific value, but I have to identify which row. I could identify the row in many ways, but I just selected one I'm going to do it by author ID. So I can say update authors and set the author's first name to Alan3, where the author ID equals 10. So that's updating a specific row. I can delete in a very similar way. If I wanted to delete a row out of authors, I could say delete from authors where, and then give it some condition. So that's how you do delete. Now, we're going to look at one more thing that's a little bit confusing on update. I could say update titles, and I could say, let's set the price equal to 0, which is an odd thing to do, where, I don't know, where the price is greater than 100. So if I go to execute this one, let's see what it did. So it actually did it, but when you go to try this, it probably won't work, and I'm going to show you why. If you go under database, actually, when you go under preferences, if you click this and you go under SQL editor and you go down here, you're going to have this will probably be checked for you, safe updates. If this is checked, it won't let you do that update statement. It's going to give you a warning. It's going to tell you to go in here and change it. And then the way to change it is you uncheck it. And not only do you have to uncheck it, but you actually have to restart your connection. So I'm going to reverse it. So I'm going to check it. And then I'm going to actually redo the connection and get back in. Now I'm back in, and we were working on books. And if I try this statement again, it says I can't do it because you're using safe mode. So you can use that to undo that safe mode. And the point being here, it's kind of a safeguard. It's saying, well, you know what? You could be changing a lot of these rows and titles, and I don't want you doing updates without using the primary key, that index we created, to identify the rows. Right, in this case, we're identifying it by price being greater than 100. So it's kind of complaining and say, I'd rather you had done that by identifying it using the ID. So you can turn off that safe mode to get that to work. Okay, so that was just a very quick summary of identifying and non-identifying relationships, whether the primary key says it must include the ID from that other table. And we also very quickly looked at inserts, updates, and deletes.